taped live at Bethesda Workshops in Nashville, Tennessee, as part of a day-long training called Breaking the Bonds of Sexual Addiction. Therapist, author, and treatment pioneer Marnie Faree presents Sexual Addiction 101. Other segments of this overview training about treating sex addiction are available on the Bethesda Workshops website, BethesdaWorkshops.org.
Good morning. Welcome to Breaking the Bonds of Sexual Addiction. We have a lot of material to cover today, a lot of different topics that we're talking about. You have a workbook, and we'll be going through that. I would ask kindly if you would hold your questions until the end of each segment, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end of the segment. If not, I'm around, and I'm glad to converse with you. Sexual addiction. This is a topic that is all over the news. It's a topic that is exploding in our culture in terms of the problem around sexual addiction, and yet there is still so much, especially out there in the general public, to be both concerned about and to lack knowledge about. Here are some of the famous faces. Some of these we might say are probably offenders/perpetrators, which is a different animal than sexual addiction. There is some overlap, but just some of the historical from way, way back. Jimmy Baker. Does anybody remember Jimmy and Tammy Faye? And then some who are more current. Today's face of sexual addiction, if we get it into a different construct, often looks like this. It is the online things. It is the apps, all of that type of activity. And it is interesting to me, and frankly, it is really upsetting to me and annoying to see what the media does with these folks who are clearly in desperate trouble, who their lives have completely fallen apart. Yes, they've done some really difficult and painful and hurtful things, but to hear the late-night comedians, the media in general, talk about them, the jokes about sexual addiction, I can tell you this is not a funny type of issue. One of the things that I also want to do this morning is to tell you a little bit about me. We're going to spend the day together, and I'm going to share a lot of information. And I would like for you to know some kind of context and history about my own story. I am Marnie. I am a grateful, recovering sex, love, and relationship addict. I have been on this journey of healing since 1992. Imperfectly, but always, always, always on the journey. And I'm so grateful for recovery. I'm a PK, preacher's kid. So I grew up in a loving Christian home. My father was a brilliant minister and especially Christian educator, did worlds of good for so many people, had a deep heart for God, and an unrecovered sex addict. Struggled all of his life with pornography, with other forms of sexual acting out, that ultimately cost him his career and disgrace. His face could have been on some of these had it been a more modern time. He crashed and burned in 1985. So I had a sense as a young child that some of the insides of our home did not match the outside perfect preacher's family that we appeared. My mother died when I was 3 years old of colon cancer. And so that, we'll talk about attachment this morning. That attachment breach was enormous in my life and extraordinarily impactful. I would also experience sexual abuse beginning at age 5 until I was 20 from one of my father's very best friends, from a male with whom my father was involved. So many complications in my life, so much trauma that I had no understanding of it all. Because our family looked great and we were highly, highly functional, everybody's super accomplished and all of that. And so I had no understanding of my story. The sexual abuse and the confusion about sex equals love, because it was a very loving, nurturing kind of exploitive relationship. So it didn't raise red flags for me, this desperately lonely little girl. But looking back, probably by the time I was 17 or 18, I was a full-blown sex love relationship addict. Very promiscuous, married very early, age 20, thought I had found the person who would fill up the black hole inside. He didn't, he couldn't, and it wasn't his job, but I didn't understand that then. Lost that marriage because of my affairs, remarried very quickly to my current husband, David. We've been married 37 and a half years, and I am grateful for that. And had a period of stability and certainly sobriety, meaning I wasn't acting out in any way. I was completely faithful to him, but I had never, ever dealt with my stuff. And so then when life got really hard, including my father's fall from grace, which was such a trigger that exploded all of this stuff inside for me, I returned to coping that I began to learn at age 5 when this man first began grooming me, which was to look for some other guy to help me process all of the pain and fear. So returned to a very extensive period of acting out. We had 2 young children. And finally, what got my attention and what was my bottom was cervical cancer caused by HPV, sexually transmitted disease. So that ultimately, along with some strong suicidal thoughts, ideations, beginning the development of a plan, led me into recovery, and I'm so grateful for that. And that began in 1991, sobriety in 1992, and have been on the path since. So I've got these, quote, important letters after my name. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm a CSAT, certified sex addiction therapist, the highest designation in our field. And to me, what gives me the authority and certainly the passion to share with you this morning is my story. And I give God the glory and the honor for redeeming so much pain in my life, including today when I get to spend a day with you. So that is some about me, and I will give you other examples of my story and illustrating different things. But we got here because I said this is a very, very painful disease issue. Here's what it looks like. At Bethesda Workshops, at our treatment intensives for clients, they do a good bit of art therapy. And the clients do a drawing of what does it feel like to be you. Obviously, this man from, probably 17, 18 years ago, one of our earlier workshops, is a brilliant artist. Most of the drawings don't look like that. Most of them are stick figures of tornadoes or, somebody that's tethered, chained to a phone or a computer screen. So obviously this man is quite the artist. He's also a surgeon. And he said, I use a scalpel every day. But what I really want is to put that knife to my own throat because of the pain and the shame of sexual addiction. This is an extremely devastating issue. And so again, I'm grateful that you are here to learn more or to be reminded of things that you know about how we work with people who are struggling with sexual addiction. This is a multifaceted problem, and it requires a multifaceted solution. And that's a very important takeaway for you of our time together today. Yes, this is a spiritual problem. Bethesda Workshops is a nonprofit. We are a Christian-based clinical treatment center. I am going to assume that most of you work in some type of Christian counseling setting, or at least you personally would identify with Christian faith. If you don't, welcome. But that is where we are coming from. So in our world of faith, we would call the behaviors that wind people up in your office as sin, right? So there is definitely that spiritual component. This is a spiritual problem. I love this quote from Chesterton. A man who knocks on the door of a brothel is looking for God. I so know that. I know that in my own story. I know that in the, by now, thousands of addicts and partners of addicts that we work with at Bethesda Workshops. They are looking for something that is very deep and highly spiritual. So beyond the sin component, this is a spiritual problem. And St. Augustine, God, you've made us for yourself. And our souls are restless until they can rest in you. This is at its core a spiritual problem. We honor that. We believe that it requires a spiritual solution. And I will say this statement in a variety of ways through the next 6.5 hours. If we look at this challenge of sexual addiction as only sin and only a spiritual matter, and we are bringing only spiritual resources to it, that is going to be ineffective and insufficient. So if that rocks your theology, I'm sorry. It's not saying God isn't enough. It's saying that all good clinical principles only reinforce and are founded on spiritual principles. So it's very important that we bring to bear the other aspects as well. And today, we will talk some in our recovery section more about the spiritual, but in general, this is going to be a clinical kind of training. But I just want to acknowledge that. This is a thinking disorder. It begins with negative false core beliefs, and we're going to explore what that means and how those come to be. But it also involves the stinking thinking. Recovery, and particularly coming out of the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous tradition, is filled with wonderful, cheesy slogans. But they're just great. You know, we get idioms and these slogans and mantras because they are accurate and because they work. And a really important one is, my own best thinking got me here. So I need someone else to help change my thinking. I cannot trust my own thinking. They're mental constructs about this issue. We also, it is a emotional problem. The flawed sense of self, the shame-based disorder, the despair that comes out in the drawings that we see all around these walls here during our workshops, particularly with addicts, but also with partners. But also the flip side, the grandiosity and the perfectionism, which is also a shame-driven construct. There is certainly a physical component beyond what people are literally doing, acting out. We'll talk about that a little bit in just a couple of minutes. But of course, there's a neurochemical component, and we'll look at that. I am so pleased that finally it seems that within the addiction community, within the largely even medical community, certainly within the clinical community, we have stopped arguing that addiction can only be about substances. We're beginning to realize process addictions actually are more core. Food and sex are the core addictions, and they are significantly harder to resolve than just the substance addictions. And so behavior is coming to be recognized. And of course, there is a relational component. The people, the clients, the participants who wind up in these rooms at Bethesda workshops know better than anyone the devastation of sexual betrayal. We will talk about that this morning in terms of partners' experience and what partners feel like, and how infidelity in all of its forms just absolutely blows up a relationship. So all of these things are part of what is called sexual addiction. So let's start defining it a little bit. Dr. Patrick Carnes, the grandfather in our field, the guru in our field, first one beginning to put together constructs and roots of addiction and treatment plans within the world, says addiction is a pathological means unhealthy, relationship. This is about a relationship. It's not just about a one-time using alcohol. That doesn't make you an alcoholic. It's not about necessarily, I'm dabbling in porn. Now, we would say, in terms of relationally and spiritually, that's a problem, but that doesn't necessarily make someone an addict. This is an ongoing pattern, and we'll look at those characteristics in just a little bit. Finally, in a marvelous step forward, the World Health Organization is recognizing what at the moment they're calling compulsive sexual behavior disorder. That's an enormous step forward. Within this country, our own DSM revision did not take that step. There's some reasons for that. It's hard to study sexual addiction. There are not enough really clear studies. And then also, frankly, this is my bias, I own it. In our country, more than at the World Health Organization's, there is tremendous weight coming from medically trained, not clinically trained people. And so just a lag there about that. But the fact that the World Health Organization has recognized sexual addiction and given some very specifics of what does this look like and how long do you have to struggle and those kinds of things is enormously helpful to our field. So I'm excited about that. I'm going to use the term sexual addiction all day long today. And I think it's helpful for you to understand that this covers a whole variety of presentations of behavior. There is some discussion in our field of individuals, including clinicians or coaches, recovery coaches or helpers, who are saying, well, my person's not a sex addict. She's a love addict. Or, this guy's not a sex addict. He's a pornography addict. And I, hopefully, respectfully disagree with that, slicing this up in that narrow way. Think about what we know about alcoholism. Sometimes somebody will say, well, I can't be an alcoholic, I just drink beer. Or, hey, I'm a good old boy, and the Jack Daniels and the hardcore whiskey, that Red Hot, that's my stuff. Or I prefer to think my flavor. I'm kind of a champagne addict. It sounds sweet and Southern and, But it's all part of this same construct. And actually, even if it's drugs, it's the same dynamics. Now, there are some treatment differences. You're working with a meth addict, that's a very different thing than working with a pot addict or your average alcoholic. There's some treatment stuff. When you're working with the love relationship addict, that's actually a harder thing than just the very sexually focused. So there's some treatment implications about that. But in terms of this whole big construct, to let this be the umbrella because all of these share commonalities underneath. So what could those be? What are some of the characteristics of an addiction? How do you know it's really an addiction? And we get that question a lot, especially we get it from partners who are calling or who are saying, how do I know my husband's really an addict? And again, the question is a little like saying, how many drinks does it take to be an alcoholic? There's not that quantifier. And certainly around sexual behavior, because sexual behavior, like food, is healthy and God-given and perfectly acceptable, within some boundaries about that. So it's not about how much sex am I having, or people, well, I'm just highly sexed. There are differences in libido of different people, but that's not what this issue is. So to think about, here's a continuum around addiction. And it could be someone who is, if we look at alcohol, who is abusing alcohol. They haven't gone down the road to being an alcoholic, but they recognize, you know what? Pretty much every day now when I come home from work, I want a glass of wine or I want a beer or I want something and this is probably not good for me. Okay. Or someone who, again, with alcohol, we would say they're in the gutter drunk. They're the homeless person. They've lost jobs, families, fortunes, that kind of thing. So there's a continuum. But here are the characteristics that make one move more toward the addiction continuum. First is obsession. Sexual addiction, any addiction, is obsessive. What does that mean? For me, my primary form of acting out was great promiscuity and then compulsive affairs. And they were very attached affairs, people with whom I had a deep and meaningful relationship. It was wrong. And so for me, I am very grateful that my recovery preceded this explosion of technology. Because, oh my goodness, would I have been in trouble. So in terms of obsession, it felt like there was this little bird always sitting on my shoulder. When might I get a call from this affair partner? When might I be willing to get a call? And I didn't want to take my children to the park This is way before cell phones, because then I wouldn't be there with this kitchen phone that I put a 30-foot cord on so I could at least, kind of drag it outside to be on the back deck and they could play in the yard. It becomes the organizing principle of life. That's obsession. The next one is compulsion. What does that mean? I keep doing what I don't want to do despite my best efforts to stop. The Apostle Paul has some things to say about that. In Romans 7, Paul says, I don't understand what I do. What I want to do, I do not do. What I hate, I do. I have the desire to do what's good, but I cannot carry it out. For what I do is not the good I want to do. No, the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. What a wretched one I am. Now, I'm not saying that our friend Apostle Paul was a sex addict. And you don't write that kind of a description without this deep, deep struggle about something. He is talking about this fight, this war between what we would theologically call the spirit and the flesh. But that's what addiction is about. And this idea of compulsion, I am compelled to do it. I can't stop. What's actually true is I can't stay stopped, or I can't stop starting again. That's what's true about addiction. But this is the part that I think is most confusing to people who aren't addicted, who aren't addicts, and most painful, so painful to partners of addicts. It's like, my person said he was gonna stop. And maybe it was with tears and emotion, and maybe he went down front in church, or he went to talk to the pastor, or he did whatever, and said, I'm never gonna do this again. And then he did. Well, of course that's hurtful and that's distressing. And that's the clear hallmark of an addiction. What's also confusing and true about this idea of compulsion, any kind of problematic behavior, including any kind of addiction, does begin with a choice. I am choosing to smoke the first cigarette under the football stadium, I am choosing to take the first drink of alcohol. I am choosing to take a hit off the joint that's getting passed around at this party. I am choosing to look at pornography. Though we'll talk this afternoon, that choice is not nearly as clear anymore because we live in a pornified culture. And there is, at some point, someone is going to then intentionally let me click and search and see what I can find. So yes, it begins with a choice. So people say, but you got a choice, just stop doing that. There comes a point where in the moment, that opportunity for choice gets removed. How does that happen? We're going to look at that. It happens because of false belief systems, but it also happens especially because of the cycle of addiction. And so in that moment, the choice is removed. I remember times just thinking, I know I'm getting ready to go meet this person again. This is really a bad idea. And it just felt like the train was just bolting down the track, and I could not stop it. Despite a rare occasional flash of, this is really probably not the best idea here. So compulsion. In the moment when someone is an addict, that clear opportunity of choice is removed. The good news of recovery, and we'll talk about that, is you can be restored to that place of choice. But this is a confusing thing for loved ones of addicts. Kind of the first cousin of the compulsion, it continues despite negative consequences. Again, for non-addicts, this is the one they're like, what part of this do you not get? This isn't working for you. For an alcoholic, you would say to somebody, this is your third DUI. Why don't you just stop drinking? Consequences, when someone is in the throes of addiction, it takes a whole lot of them to pile up enough that someone is hitting a bottom often and is going to say, wow, I've got to do something about this. So despite job loss, despite cervical cancer and 3 surgeries in a year for that, I continued to act out with this person. That's crazy, right? Of course. That's sinful, right? Absolutely. It's an addiction. Continuing despite clear negative consequences. Those are the 2 hallmarks. If you hear anyone that you're working with saying, I really don't want to do this anymore, I really don't enjoy this anymore, and people often, this is why folks like the World Health Organization are at the moment classifying this as a compulsive disorder rather than addictive disorder, because there's sure a compulsive component to it. I keep doing this. I don't even really want to do this anymore, but I can't stop. Wow, that's your biggest red flag of, I'm dealing now with an addict. So to tell them to make better choices, to read scripture more, to go talk with their priest or pastor, maybe those are helpful things, but that's not enough. Continuing despite negative consequences. And then an addiction creates tolerance. We understand that with alcohol. It takes more and more and more to get that same buzz. There are people who are, often it's that they're arrested for DUI or public drunkenness, and they have a blood alcohol level of, 2.8 or 3.7 or something that would kill me. Probably kill most of us in this room. But they have become so tolerant to it that they can walk across the floor with that level of blood alcohol. The same thing can happen. There's a huge neurochemistry about addiction. And I want to show you a video about some of the neurochemistry of addiction. It's from a fellow CSAT. Her name is Paula Hall. She's from the UK.
Our brains
so
are
this
full
narrator
of neural
has this
maps.
marvelous
Every time
British
we learn something,
accent.
we create a new neural map in our
It's
brain.
a short video about
So, for example, you might have a
the
neural map about cooking a meal. You may have a
neurochemistry of
neural
addiction.
map that
And
is
I'm gonna
around
access
learning
it.
French or maybe learning to drive. And in fact, the more you practice that skill, the deeper that map becomes, the stronger it becomes in our brain, to the point where you don't even have to think about it very much anymore. So initially, when you started learning to drive the car, you had to think very consciously about where the gear stick was and where the accelerator and the brake was. But over time, as that neural map in your brain becomes stronger and stronger, those actions and behaviours just become automatic. Now, unfortunately, that also happens with addiction. Sex addiction rewires the brain. It creates a new neural map. And one of the key things that helps us remember those maps is a chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical that is the common denominator in all addiction. It's a chemical that reminds us of the things that are most pleasurable in our lives. So something that triggers dopamine is something that is going to strengthen your neural map. So thinking of perhaps the map of England as a metaphor, imagine Brighton represents your addiction. Brighton represents your acting out behaviour. As someone who's been to Brighton, I know that it's a lovely place. It's very exciting. It's full of lots of different things to do. Somewhere you can lose yourself. Perhaps that's also true of your addiction. London represents everyday life. So you live in London, it's where your everyday life happens. But when you want a dopamine high, you go to Brighton. Now, if you go to Brighton on a regular basis in your addiction, if your acting out has become a regular thing that you do, then that neural pathway in your brain is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. The more often you drive down that neural pathway, the stronger it will become, the more automatic it will become, like when you learnt to drive a car. So that neural pathway in your brain, that road from London to Brighton, becomes a motorway. It becomes the M23, a fast, easy route to access dopamine. Recovery from addiction means not going to Brighton. And it means not thinking about Brighton either, because we know that when you fantasize, you actually trigger the dopamine pathway in the same way. You need never to go to Brighton again, so that that motorway can begin to get potholed and grow over. It will become weaker and weaker. But instead, you need to develop new roads, new ways of accessing dopamine. So let's think of some other coastal towns. Perhaps Portsmouth is going to represent another way you can access dopamine. That might be going out with friends. Maybe Littlehampton is playing golf. Maybe Eastbourne is taking up a new musical instrument. Maybe spending more time with family and friends. With loved ones is Bournemouth. Initially, when you start trying to access those neural pathways, they're going to be little B roads, and you might find yourself having to go to Bournemouth via Leeds. It may take a long time to get to that point of dopamine, and I'm sorry to say, but it's not going to be quite like Brighton. But if you're tempted to go back to Brighton again, you are just going to strengthen that neural pathway. What you have to do is keep going to Bournemouth, keep going to Portsmouth, keep accessing those other types of dopamine so that those roads can become stronger and stronger and stronger.
Our video told us about dopamine. I want you to know that there are some other neurochemicals that are huge players in addiction. You, generally speaking, are probably familiar with some of these or have heard them. You know serotonin, a feel-good neurotransmitter. Medicines like Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, or dealing with serotonin and how it works in the brain. Oxytocin is the bonding neurochemical. It's released at skin-to-skin contact. It's one of the reasons why breastfeeding is so important, why it is so important for dads to hold that child skin to skin. Oxytocin is also released at just the anticipation of being with people whom we find safe and affirming. So think about oxytocin has enormous implications around sexuality, skin-to-skin contact. Adrenaline, that's that leap tall buildings at a single bound kind of rush that you get. And adrenaline is a big player in addiction. We find that it's very common for male sex addicts to also be adrenaline junkies. They love riding fast motorcycles or driving fast cars or doing some of the extreme kind of sports. Paragliding and that kind of stuff, that very energizing kind of neurochemical. Endorphins are the body's natural pain relievers. They say they're released at the runner's high. I can't imagine that or why this is good enough that you'd go through the first 23 miles of the marathon to get here, but people do it. My son-in-law tells me that that's pretty cool. Okay. Catecholamines are technically not neurochemicals. They're other things that I cannot describe to you, but they're pleasure opioid-like substances within the brain. So, as well as dopamine, which is huge. Dopamine is the biggest player in addiction. Lots of research has informed us about that. And several common things release dopamine. Alcohol releases dopamine. Nicotine releases dopamine. It's interesting to me, when I first began going to 12-step meetings, and I did my early 12-step work in a women's-only AA meeting. And so here are women who have been sober for a long, long time, but they're like 4 coffee pots going and everybody's smoking in the meeting. And, I'm like, if I'm going to be around all the smoke, I'm going to smoke for a while. I mean, hey, And it's, our bodies are so wonderfully made, and we intuitively know what makes us feel good. We intuitively are neurochemicists of our own brains. I see lots of coffee cups this morning. I've only had about 3, not quite enough yet. But, that's something that caffeine releases dopamine that makes us feel good. So recovering alcoholics and drug addicts who weren't getting their dopamine hit from their substance, they wanted it from somewhere. And smoking's not necessarily good for you, but caffeine is a whole lot better than alcohol. And sexual activity and sexual thought. Think about that. Just the fantasizing, just the obsession, just the looking at pornography before you even get to the point of masturbating to it releases dopamine. Dopamine is huge. But what we know, different things hit on these different neurotransmitters, neurochemicals. As far as the real scientists, the medical doctors have been able to determine now, the neuroscientists, the brain studies, sexual activity is the only one thing that hits every single known neurocritter that makes us feel good. I find that amazing. I find that wonderful. I find that as a loving God who wanted this sexual relationship to be the best, literally most pleasurable thing on earth and created it that way. But we as a culture and as individuals and certainly as addicts taken what was intended to be so wonderful and we have prostituted it literally for unhealthy pleasure. And the internet is, of course, the big player. They call it the AAA engine of the internet. It is anonymous, or people think it is, until Ashley Madison puts their names everywhere. It is affordable, generally speaking, and it is so accessible. And it is also supercharged. I just think it is important for you to understand that today's pornography is not my father's pornography. It is not my pornography. I'm 62 years old. It is not necessarily even my children's pornography at age 33 and 35. Today's pornography, this is an entirely different level. And we'll talk about that some more this afternoon when we talk about culture and pornography and adolescence. But supercharged images that are intentionally created that way by the pornographers. This is a very different thing that is highly, highly addictive, just physiologically by all the interactive stuff, even before you get to the teledonics and all of the webcams and all of that kind of stuff. Supercharged. And so what I believe, and I have seen it for the last 22 years of working in this field, primarily working with Christians, is that sexual addiction, primarily in the form of pornography, is the addiction of choice among people of faith. That's sobering to me. And so as we look at this issue and how it's impacting the church and how it's impacting people we work with and perhaps people we care about and perhaps even ourselves, that we are not alone. This is an epidemic that is sourcing across our culture and across the church. I like this. You've been online a year. You want to get off and get a life? Most people click, nope. Keep going. So what are we talking about when we mention sexual addiction? What are the presentations of this? Well, they're things with which you are familiar. Pornography and masturbation. Some people masturbate without pornography, but often pornography is the fuel for compulsive masturbation. Cybersex, all of its different forms. For lack of a better word, I call it the stereotypical sex addict. This person that we used to think was only male, who's going to strip clubs, who's having the lap dances, the massage parlors, the one-night stands, hiring prostitutes, may even include some offending behavior like exhibitionism or voyeurism or different kinds of paraphilias. Romance, relationship, love addict. The behaviors look a little different, but it's still within this umbrella of sexual addiction. And this is affecting men and women. We used to think, the same way we thought about alcohol, that this was only a male problem. Surely women didn't drink to excess like that. Today we know that close to, statistically, literally half of alcoholics are female. They don't seek treatment as much, but they struggle with this disease. There's some statistics about how many women struggle with sexual addiction. They're largely around internet-based activity, and that statistic is coming in and has remained steady since I have been working in this field. About 1/3 of visitors to an adult website are female. So I really believe that by the time we are able to research and add in all of the love relationship addict type people who aren't necessarily as involved online as some others are, that we will find that, like alcoholism, women struggle with this issue just about as much as do men. Again, the shame is greater, and not nearly as many women seek treatment, and women are still very underserved in this population. There's a marvelous movie that is out now called Unlovable. Unlovable by Charlene de Guzman. D-E, capital G, U-S-U-Z-M-A-N, something like that, if you Google Unlovable and that movie. A warning, there are a few mildly triggering images, but I've gotten the opportunity to meet and to get to know Charlene, presented with her on a panel recently at the symposium for the certifying body for the CSAT designation. She's a delightful young woman and has written and is starring in a movie about her own experience of recovery from sexual addiction. So I'm glad that the faces are beginning to have more females presenting as people who are struggling with sexual addiction. It's very much the silent kind of underbelly of this issue. So when we look at how do we view this thing we call sex addiction, we are going to spend most of our time on this classic trauma model. In our next segment, we'll look at the trauma roots for addiction. Those who are looking at this only as the sin component come from the moral model, which actually is much more shaming and unhelpful than helpful in any way. There is a contemporary model that we're not going to spend much time on, but I wanted you to be aware of it. A colleague and someone who's facilitated here at Bethesda Workshops, Jenna Remersma, and another colleague, Dr. Michael Seitzma, have published a paper as they've codified what they're seeing, and it's resonated with clinicians across the country. This whole group of folks, they're largely young people, say at least 30 and younger, who just because of the incredible exposure to such sexual content are getting, from being inundated with it so much, are getting caught in that snare. And the culture. These are folks who are not reporting as much overt sexual abuse trauma as some of us older folks are reporting. But what I believe is that their sexual trauma is the culture, this sexualized culture. But it's a little bit different looking at it, and this, frankly, is easier to treat. There's a whole movement, a secular movement around men primarily. Some women are a part of it, especially around compulsive masturbation and pornography use. Different online forums, NoFap, and some other things that are part of that. So this is one way of conceptualizing this issue. So how do you identify it? I like this very simple screen called the Pathos to just ask people. I believe in every single clinical interview, every single intake session, every single, however coaches, recovery coaches are asking about these kinds of things. Most clinicians now ask, tell me about your alcohol use. We should be asking every single person, tell me about your pornography use. What is your experience with pornography? Why don't we ask this? It's everywhere. And to just open that door would help so much someone who's struggling, who might find it difficult to confess that. You can use this simple screen. Are you preoccupied around your sexual behavior? Are you ashamed about it? Have you ever sought help before? Do you think what you're doing has hurt other people? Do you ever feel out of control? Do you feel sad, depressed about your sexual behavior? Any yes answers or a flag, this needs some more exploration. So it's just this very simple way. I love if especially pastors would use this kind of a screen to just open a door in talking about this issue. There's some other assessments online at sexhelp.com, the SAST-R, Sexual Addiction Screening Test Revised. It's anonymous. People fill out 40 some odd questions. Doesn't take long. They're yes, no. The computer will score it for you and give you an answer. It's not tracking anything at all, so it's a very safe way for people to get an idea. How does my behavior measure up? Am I kind of in trouble? There's an internet sexual screening test, but the SAST-R has now incorporated a lot more questions around pornography and internet than it did in the beginning. For those who are CSAT, Certified Sexual Addiction Therapists, there's this enormous, big deal instrument called the SDI, Sexual Dependency Inventory. It requires lots of training and is not available to the general public, but can provide more information even about personality disorders and some other stuff that might be helpful, and you have to be the CSAT to be able to use it. But if somebody is just asking, calling you up saying, do you give the SDI, so you'll know what we're talking about. And then finally, for this segment about what is sexual addiction, it's so important for you to understand the cycle of addiction. This is just absolutely key. We'll revisit it again some in our recovery segment. But the cycle begins with wounds, which we'll explore in our next segment, and the shame that is created. The shame people feel because of their behavior, the shame because of their woundedness. We'll explore that more in the next segment. Right now we're looking at more at this primary cycle. And then some trigger happens. What is a trigger? In this culture, a trigger is breathing. Sex is everywhere. Everywhere. So the triggers could be just coming from the culture. They could be very specific. You know, I get triggered because I see this car that is the same make that my person drove, or I see this very sexualized image, or I have a smell, and that's the kind of cologne or perfume that my person wore. It's a song. Media is incredibly triggering for sex addicts. They really need to be very careful about the things they watch and listen to. So some trigger happens. And then the person begins to preoccupy, begins to just think about. In religious language, we may call this now lust is coming in. I'm beginning to go there. I'm beginning to think in my mind. Maybe my trigger makes me uncomfortable. They can also be emotions. I can be sad. I can be feeling shame. I can be angry. I can be happy. If I'm an adrenaline junkie, I'm going to celebrate with something around sex. And I begin to think about what has triggered me and what's going on in my head. And what moves me from my preoccupation, my trigger, my thinking about it, down to my acting out is this thing called rituals. And understanding rituals is just so very important if you're going to work with people who are addicted. What is a ritual? There are as many rituals as there are people and as there are forms of acting out. Today, many rituals around pornography are very, very quick, and they're very simple. My guess is everybody in here has a smartphone. It's not going to take you 30 seconds. You know, if you had Wi-Fi password to the Wi-Fi in here, to be accessing incredible amounts of inappropriate, explicit material. Now, if you're going to be able to masturbate to that, that's going to take you a little more of a ritual to get the privacy and that kind of thing, but that's still pretty short and pretty simple. That's a very common ritual. Some rituals are much more elaborate around someone who is paying for sex. Well, they have a ritual, I'm going to Chicago, so before I get there, I'm going to look up on Backdoor or Craigslist or wherever to find the list of escorts or whatever they're called in that city. And I'm going to be sure I have some cash, so I don't want this appearing on my credit card. And I get there, and maybe I'm even going to buy a burner phone, so when I get home, somebody is not going to see that I have accessed this. All of those are steps in a ritual. Does that make sense? A ritual around affairs can be longer. Most of my rituals were months long of increasing contact and emotional connection with a man that on its face might not have been inappropriate. Can you have a conversation with a guy? Sure. Can you talk about how wonderful the sermon was? Sure. But for me, I learned those were all parts of trying to get that connection and all parts of the ritual. So to understand the ritual is key. It's why addicts will say, I kind of woke up and realized I had acted out again. I literally did that. I prayed, I begged God, I promised I'm not going to do this again, and all of a sudden I would like, oh my word, I just kissed this person. Or something much more. How did I get here? And I had no clue of a very clear ritual that by now I could outline for you, 17 steps. And today, 26 years later, I'm very, very careful about all those. I, generally speaking, do not go to have lunch with a man. There's some exceptions, some professional settings, but I be sure that my husband knows, that my staff knows, that they're just knowing the rituals is so important. The rituals that lead to the acting out, whatever its flavor, leads to despair. Oh my goodness, I've done this again. What a terrible person I am. Which leads me, how can I feel better? Because I'm feeling like a worthless piece of crap at the moment. I want to feel better. And it also leads perhaps this shame and guilt cycle back reinforcing my woundedness. Does that make sense? The full page cycle of addiction is located in the back pocket of your workbook. So you'll have a way to hand that out for people that you're working with. What is addiction? It's unmanageable. It's compulsive. It is absolutely a biologically based construct, neurochemically driven, especially dopamine. There's a specific cycle that drives it. These are core components. We'll look in another segment now, after a break, at where's this coming from.